Greetings, Emmett here from Reading for Wisdom. Today we've got a real cracker of a book. As regular viewers of this channel will know, one of the areas that we are fascinated by, that we read very widely on, is totalitarianism, authoritarianism in world history. So we featured on the channel before books about communism, but they have tended to focus on specific figures, Stalin, for example, and specific countries like Russia, and of course totalitarianisms, related totalitarianisms like Nazism in Germany. But today, the special book that we're going to look at dates back from 2003 by great author Robert Harvey, and that is Comrades, The Rise and Fall of World Communism. And this is one of the few books, certainly in my collection, that focus on the whole of communism, its whole history, its whole global history, its beginnings, the thought origins, shall we say, and pretty much country by country and decade by decade, how it evolved in its terrible, terrible fashion until eventually many of the building blocks of world communism fell at the end of the 1980s, the early 1990s. Of course, communism has never gone away. Anyway, that in mind, so this book by Harvey is quite good for the fact he's a great journalist. Really accomplished, smooth writer. But also he was a member of the British Parliament, and he was an MP just at the time that Gorbachev was appearing on the scene in Russia. And of course that figure, very controversial figure, had a lot to do with the fall of the Soviet Union. I personally don't think he intended for the Soviet Union to fall. I think that was more an accident than anything else, but certainly a very well regarded figure in many parts of the West, even though I suspect in Russia many folk question the Gorbachev legacy from their point of view. But back to the book. So Harvey, as an MP, as a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee in the UK, had a chance to meet communist leaders. Very well travelled, very urbane, highly educated guy. And this book is a cracker. So from the word go, opening page, we get a real sense of the ideological underpinnings of communism, but also a ripping away of the intellectual facades. And Harvey rips in and really shows communism for what it really was. So Harvey spends quite a bit of time at the beginning of the book really probing into the thought, particularly of Marx, and looking at his theories and pointing out where he got things maybe half right, but where he got things spectacularly wrong. And one of the areas that Harvey is most critical of is Marx's notions, later taken up by Lenin, about how the state would transform from being controlled by the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, into being controlled by the dictatorship of the proletariat, and how this would then transform into this utopian society. And of course we saw how wrong that is. Let's listen to Harvey. For Marx, the central progression was from feudalism to bourgeois society to proletarian revolution. Marx's definition of feudalism was, broadly and not inaccurately, a society dominated by a small number of landowners with rigid privileges who held the great majority in serfdom or slavery. The bourgeois revolutionaries, according to Marx, swept this traditional system away, and in this respect he quite admired the bourgeoisie who, by replacing static repression with the conditions for urbanization and industrialization, achieved significant advances. But because the bourgeois were themselves exploiters, and because of Marx's theory of the concentration of capital in fewer and fewer hands, ultimately they had to be overthrown by the state acting in the name of an idealized proletariat. The big mistake Marx made in retrospect was in believing that the state would prove more enlightened than the bourgeoisie. For once the Marxist-Leninists controlled the levers of power, they reverted to the pattern of the feudal state. Rulers entrenched in privilege, bound by no legal norms, lording it over a population who, like the serfs, had no rights because the state, under Marxist-Leninist doctrine, reflected the people's interests. How could the people require rights to protect themselves against themselves? Once nationalism was added to this brew, it became indistinguishable from feudal tyranny. To a Westerner, Sergei Eisenstein's incredible film, Ivan the Terrible, is a repellent, if magnificent, exposition of tyranny and paranoia. To Stalin, who permitted, then banned, this extraordinary piece of lèse-majesté, it gloriously portrayed him as a medieval tyrant and nationalist. Similarly, Mao's eventual capricious emulation of the Chinese emperors of old was no accident. He was the new absolute ruler of a vast population stripped of any rights, because as secretary of the Communist Party and supreme ruler of the proletariat, he represented their best interests. The communist creed came to combine the ancient theories of despotism and the divine right of kings, being both nationalistic and feudal, with the people stripped of such bourgeois rights as the rule of law, the right to property, and the vote. To be fair to Marx, this was not his original formulation, although his espousal of force to achieve his aims pointed in that direction. It was Lenin, with his absolutist invocations to control of the revolution by a select few and the need for ruthlessness and violence in the cause of revolution, who marched the creed forward, or one could say backwards, to the feudal idea of an absolute state acting in the name of the people stripped of their rights. And Stalin, with his creed of socialism in one country and eventually of heroic resistance to the Nazis, who added the exaltation of nationalism, Alexander Nevsky and Ivan the Terrible fending off the barbarian hordes threatening Mother Russia. So it's pretty heady stuff, this book, and I would have to read out just about every paragraph to convey to you the sense of passion that Harvey brings to the subject. Harvey, a true Democrat and a humanist, that we can tell from his writings, he loathes communism. He loathes the reality of it. He's not that interested really in its ideology from the idealistic or academic perspective. It's really, how does this play out in reality? Not well. So once Harvey starts off with really giving us an underpinning of the flaws in communist doctrine and how this actually played out over time and in various different countries, he then takes us on a bit of a time travel. So we get to see the beginnings of the revolution in Russia, takes us right the way through Stalinism. Later on in the book, we see the settling of the Soviet Union into a dirge-like plod under the Brezhnevs and the like. But then, of course, we look at many other countries. So China, fascinating sections on China, and really the key differences intellectually, which are fascinating and doctrinally, between Maoism and Marxist-Leninism. We get lots of sideshows, Eastern Europe, some really fascinating chapters on, how the movement sort of willingly sprang up in certain parts of Eastern European countries and how others were forced into it. The section on Poland is really, really illuminating. For people of my generation, General Jaruzelski was quite a villain. He was what became effectively a military dictator, resisting, or so it seemed at the time, the Solidarity movement. But strangely, Jaruzelski comes across as a bit more of a sympathetic figure in Harvey's telling, a military patriot, effectively trying to balance the needs of his country, the security of his country, the internal well-being of his country against the looming threat of Soviet invasion. And of course, what we saw throughout the 50s and the 60s was the Soviets' willingness to enforce their diktat over large swathes of the world by military intervention, brutal military intervention. There's also some very interesting historically little side journeys. Euro-communism, so the form of communism that sort of sprang up within trade union movements and parts of politics in countries like Italy, so part of the West, but a more sort of respectable form of communism. And I would argue that that form is alive and well to this day. For me, though, one of the high points, apart from Harvey really doing an expose on Lenin, is Harvey's look at China. And the question of China and its nature as a state is, to this very day, of course, a more important question for us than certainly our musings about the old Soviet Union that thankfully is dead and gone. It's been replaced by something different, but certainly something, in my view, much more benign. But in China, we still see the state that Mao created. Let's have Harvey give us a bit of a horrific glimpse into that state. At the peak of the repressive system was the Public Security Ministry, responsible not only for political trials, executions and the labour camps, but also for the vast control apparatus. The Central Investigation Department, a small organisation, dealt with foreign espionage. The three main organs of control were the regional police, the Danwei, and the country's ubiquitous street committees. The Danwei was simply every person's work organisation that, in the huge faceless society that is China, gave him his identity, more so than his name did. Usually based in a person's place of employment, it acted as a substitute family. It arranged his children's clothes, his housing, even his rations. The Danwei had to approve marriages or movement from one city to another. The police had checkpoints outside these to make sure that people did not leave their cities illegally. The Danwei compiled a dossier on each individual. There was no escape for the average Chinese from this system of continuous assessment throughout his life. The street committee watched over people when they were away from work, at home. It could search apartments without warning, monitor the minute aspects of daily life, including bedtime and visitors, and try to impose family planning. It could report people to their Danwei, so that those who behaved irregularly at home were often denied promotion at work. And it had access to a part-time reserve, the urban militia, or the police. Few ordinary Chinese were rash enough to cross these committees. In the cities, the system of files ensures that every person's education, work, friendships and misdemeanours, including anonymous accusations, are recorded and may secretly cause him trouble in promotion or police harassment. The Chinese describe the files as a shroud that wraps you all your life. The same system operated in the countryside with an added refinement. There were more than 100 million loudspeakers in China, most in peasant houses, with broadcasts of party music and information that could not be turned off. Indoctrination, surveillance, hierarchy. The system was cosy enough for the mute conformist, but smothering those with independent minds. The one-party system and the centralised state structure all remained in place despite Deng's attempt to allow free enterprise in industry and agriculture. These instruments of political control were too useful for any government to dispense with. China was ruled by hierarchical authority, through a class system as rigid as anything under the emperors, and much more so than its fellow Asian developing countries, where a man with nothing could get to the top through initiative. To be among the ruling 3% in China was to be privileged to a degree that existed in almost no other country. Privilege and coercion went hand in hand with inefficiency. By the standards of most Asian developing countries, China lagged badly behind. Conditions for the peasant majority of the population remained unchanged from centuries ago. The progress of the past 30 years could not be gainsaid. China had found its own way to development, a slow, brutal, turbulent way, which left it lagging well behind its ancient peers. So So that was Harvey giving us an insight into China, even after Deng Xiaoping's reforms following Mao's death. And gosh, what can we say? The question is, how much has China and some of the other totalitarian regimes that has inspired and support, how much has it really changed since then? A moot question. So, all in all, this is a very, very comprehensive book. As I said at the beginning, it's probably one of the few books that gives a whole overview of the history of communist rule. 2003 it was published. Much water under the bridge since then. I'd really dearly love to see if Harvey has written a follow-on from this since. It's not something I'm aware of. I should check that out. Highly recommended book. Author so knowledgeable, so well researched. But if you're looking for balance, I don't think this is the book for you. Harvey nails his flag to the mast from the go. He abhors totalitarianism. He abhors communism. And he eviscerates its history. He eviscerates its fellow travelers, its apologists, with fact about the brutalization of human beings. When we read George Orwell's 1984, and you read this side by side, keeps you awake at night. So, if you like the type of books that we review on this channel, please do go below, subscribe, give us a tick, and follow us through some of our other channels and endeavours. More information on those below. See you next time.